The Cyber Grand Challenge was a 2-year effort to pioneer cyber conflict between artificial intelligence. The challenge was sponsored by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, to test the viability of future automated systems that could defend networks from advanced intruders without human intervention. At stake was the potential for revolution in the field of network defense, future systems that could guard the network civilization depends on for transportation, commerce, and critical infrastructure. On the eve of the contest, DARPA I2O's Deputy Director Brian Pierce cuts the last network connection into the contest network. Now, for the first time, these automated hacking systems are operating in a fully autonomous mode, disconnected from the teams that created them. 7 teams spent 2 years of grueling competition building bots that could defeat their opponents and capture the $2 million top prize. This 2-year development race balanced research risk against the tremendous work of autonomy engineering. Whittled down from 104 registered teams in 2013, the 7 finalists were disconnected from their creations, spectators to their own victory or defeat. The automated systems are installed into the Paris Hotel in the heart of the DEF CON hacking conference, with thousands of attendees on hand to witness AI's first flight into the game of hackers. Capture the Flag. Capture the Flag, CTF, is a simulation of real-world cyber conflict, complete with novel attacks, real-time defenses, simulated users, and a real network. CTF victory is never about bringing the best tools. It's about bringing the best minds. Minds capable of expert reverse engineering, exploit development, fast patching, and network defense in a high-pressure, real-time game. For the first time, these minds will be artificial. Powering the challenge is a massive compute outlay installed by a DARPA logistics team. The Paris Hotel has been modified with a highly redundant liquid cooling system capable of removing nearly 0.5 megawatt of heat from the machines. Each AI contains over 1,000 Xeon cores and 16 terabytes of RAM and is connected to a custom-built isolated game network. Every part of the compute outlay on stage has been engineered to have a fallback plan. The game is running on a custom operating system layer and is being monitored by a forensics computer capable of replaying game events in a high-fidelity sandbox. The only humans inside the air gap are the referees, veterans of the DEF CON CTF circuit, and developers of the core infrastructure code. If everything goes according to plan, their only job will be to sit back and watch.
Ready? Ready?
At 9 a.m. on Thursday, August 4th, 2016.
Go. Walker, we're go. Thumbs up.
The DARPA program manager gives the thumbs up to the referees to start the challenge. In his pocket are 3 speeches. 1 speech in case the hardware suffers a critical failure. 1 speech in case the AIs or the operating framework fails and the challenge is scrubbed. 1 speech for the emergence of cyber defense AI. At this moment, the future of the challenge was completely unknown. Here to recount the day's events are 2 veterans of the hacking community, Debbie Nuttall and Jordan Wines. Debbie and Jordan have been leading the post-CGC analysis team through a deep dive into the complex mountain of game data to truly understand the interactions and capabilities of the finalist cyber reasoning systems. Let's join them.
There we are in Vegas. Behind the scenes, we're offside to the stage in our little control room with all the production people and just this array of computer equipment splayed out for us to do the analysis on.
Yep. And we're hoping to have a game to analyze, right? We're waiting, but we don't really know. As soon as the first robot arm comes across and drops the data, then we get round data. But until then, we are...
Yeah, and this is the culmination of years of work for us and years of work for the CRS developers. This was an exciting moment.
Yeah, so I guess we had a couple things right in mind. 1, is their data, like, are they live? And then 2, are we going to sort of succeed at the goals? Are we going to see interaction? Are we going to see successful POVs? Are we going to see successful patches? Like, those were sort of the next things that we wanted to see. And we had no idea how long that would take. Would it be right away or would it be a while?
Here we're at round 0, and the game infrastructure is deploying challenges. We're going to see 10 challenges get deployed out to all the teams. This is what we call the arena view. So this is the main sort of visual interface to see what's actually going on during the game.
And this is by round, right? So of course in the corner we've got our round number, so you can see what the current round is. And at round 0, things are just being deployed. There's not much you can do other than start to analyze the challenges. You could submit a POV, you could submit a replacement, but those aren't going to be live until later rounds.
Yeah, and we see these cards here, and each one of these is for one challenge. We have a name for the challenge, and then we have a description of the vulnerabilities. It's important to remember that each one of these challenges is custom written from scratch just for this game. All this is never before seen code, and then the vulnerabilities are all 0-day vulnerabilities. So 10 challenges get deployed at the beginning of the game. That feels like a lot to me for
That is a
CTF.
whole lot, absolutely. There are some CTFs where they deploy 10 challenges at the beginning, but that's because they're going to last for 24 or 48 hours. These challenges are going to last for maybe about an hour each total, and so they're much quicker turnaround. They've got a finite window to look at each one of these challenges.
So here we have round 1.
It starts off pretty busy.
About 5 minutes long. So round 1, we actually see these cones flying through the air. These are POVs actually being thrown by the teams.
So that meant in round 0, teams submitted them, and we see at least 2 or 3. We've got Rubeus and Jima, and I think may have had one in there as well. So they are submitting their POVs in round 0, and we'll see what happens as the scores.
That's great
tabulate.
news. Like
Right.
at least some of the machines are interacting.
They're
like,
live. We know
the
they're at least
system is working. The game is happening.
Right. Whether they'll succeed or not, we'll see.
But we don't actually see any scoring happening in round 1.
So far, nothing. Right. So if we look right now at the score, there's some very small amount of differences in terms of the score. These are mostly just due to sort of noise and the fact that there's a lot of load in the services, a lot of things running. Very, very small amounts of score changes can happen, but essentially no major differences. These are just really performance artifacts. So far, though, there's been no successful POVs, no one's lost security, and everyone's availability is about the same. So at the beginning of round 2, we've seen some teams being live, and now we're seeing more POVs, so this is good. Oh, and we see a couple of successful ones.
Oh, check this out. Let's break it down here. We see Rubeus scoring on 3 different teams. So I want to talk about what we're looking at here. Each one of these hex tiles represents one challenge in the game. And the hex tile has so much information built into it. Obviously, we see right here, when someone scores, it lights up with a giant circle of the team that scored against them. So
Team that owned them.
Team that owned them, yeah. So Rubeus owned them. We see that lighting up here. We also have one down here, Crispy getting a score. So we see that. We can also look at the hex tiles and look at these gears here. These gears represent that the team has submitted a replacement and they're down for that round. The team has to be down for one round when they submit a replacement. That's a penalty to make sure they don't keep doing it over and over and over again.
Yeah, because if you could do nothing but replace a binary over and over and over, it defeats the point of consensus evaluation.
Yeah, it's not a practical real-world technique, but it certainly would have allowed them to game this competition. The other thing that we see on the hex tiles is that once a team has been scored against, they've lost that security, their white border goes away. So on the ones that haven't been scored, you see there's a white border, but if someone has owned you, then you lose your white border, indicating you've lost some security.
And we also see this sort of pie chart. So at the very end, we know who Rubeus has been successful on. And in this case, it's everyone. Every other team was vulnerable, so all 6 of those slices are filled in.
They're against Thermal Controller 2.
And speaking of score, we've also got the scores tabulated up at the end of the round. So we have, from left to right, we have the availability, the security, and the evaluation. So availability means how performant were you? Were you too slow? Because if you can replace something and make it secure, but it's 10 times slower, nobody's going to use it. So you have to keep it fast. You can't use too much memory. And you have to retain the original functionality. So if you break it and just return 0, well, you're secure, but again, not very useful. The security is pretty straightforward. Did anyone score a POV against you? If they did, you lose security. If they didn't, you're still secure. An evaluation, of course, is whether you proved a flaw in somebody else. If you're able to exploit them, then your evaluation score goes up. Otherwise, it stays sort of at the default.
So it's pretty similar to a traditional attack defense, CTF game, right? The one thing that's different here with CGC is that availability score does include the performance.
That is different and is a bit unusual, as measuring the performance characteristics is sort of a new requirement. All those points get added per service at the end of the round, and then that gets added into the round score. And so you see at the end of the round, we can look at the relative differences, and we can see Mechafish really took a hit from that patching all their services being down, the availability being down. But Rubeus, on the other hand, did a great job with their POVs.
Yeah, so Rubeus was written by Deep Red. Deep Red's a team formed from engineers at Raytheon.
They've got a long history in CTF. A number of their former members had been CTF players, although the majority of the team this time, I think, was more of their developers. That they are well known in the security space and have certainly come out guns firing in this one by successfully proving a vulnerability against all of their competitors. And again, within 5 minutes, this challenge was deployed in round 1. So because this is Thermal Controller V2, this particular challenge, was deployed in round 1. That means within that same round, they found the flaw, they created the proof of vulnerability, and by round 2, they're getting those points against their competitors.
That is a really nice, strong start for Rubeus.
Quick turnaround and much faster than a human could do. So now we're into round 3 already. This is, again, the 3rd round that a POV could be successful, round 1 being the very first round that they could have as the challenges were deployed in round 0. And let's see how many we've got.
Yeah, we see a lot of scoring here by Xandra on this challenge. They seem to have got to everyone on that one there.
And that's one of the gold ones, right? Tell me more about those.
So the gold hex tiles represent challenges that we call the rematch challenges.
And you were the author of the rematch challenges too, so I think you know a little bit about them.
Yeah, I know a little bit about them. I wrote this set of challenges, and what we were trying to do here is create challenges that reflect some well-known real-world bugs. This is not only so that we can kind of understand what this technology is capable of, but to make it accessible to the audience too. So these challenges they're all custom code, just like any other challenge in the game, but the vulnerability is very closely patterned after the vulnerability that was exploited in the real world.
I mean, I remember some of these. SQL Slammer, for example, got me in on call of the weekend to come into the university. I worked at the time to fix. Yeah, I remember that one. There was definitely some serious impact from some of these, or others very interesting technical details about them that kind of makes them fun, I think.
Absolutely. So the one that we just saw being exploited was the address resolution service.
That was my Saturday.
That was your Saturday. So this one's patterned after the SQL Slammer bug. You may have known at the time. If not, this was a very straightforward stack-based buffer overflow. It wasn't actually a SQL injection, as some people might think, maybe the younger crowd.
Based on the name, yeah.
But it was a companion service that ran next to Microsoft SQL Server, and all it was doing was trying to provide resolution for multiple instances running on the same server.
So when you've modeled it, you've recreated this similar kind of vulnerability. You've done it in a different service and different protocol, because all of these protocols are unique, but just inspired by, maybe? Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not using the original protocol, but it's using a new protocol that is suspiciously similar to the original.
And the reason for that, too, is that so that none of the competitors came in with foreknowledge. So if you tested your system on existing vulnerabilities,
which we presume that they would.
They most likely would have done. It gave them a leg up in terms of developing techniques and approaches, but it doesn't actually mean they sort of have a hard-coded recognizer for that protocol.
So special characters are changed.
Right. There's no HTTP, there's no SMTP, there's no standard protocol that we'd be familiar with as it is. It's going to be different for the game.
Yeah, exactly. So we can look at the code right here. We see the vulnerability. Up at the top, we have a stack buffer being declared of 64 bytes long, and then we have a very suspicious string copy that isn't bounded by length. So we're copying arbitrarily off of the network into that stack buffer. That's your buffer overflow 101.
It happens a lot for sure, and the stir copy to stir in copy is common. And I noticed it's inside of this if-def, right? So all of the authors had to define an official patch, I guess we could call it, right?
Yeah, so we wanted to make sure that the vulnerability was patchable, right, obviously, as part of the game, and then it was part of the automated infrastructure. Just putting this code in here allowed us to build a patched version, an unpatched version, and then do some testing against it. You can see here, obviously, that if we had written secure code, we would have used the string copy with a length bound on it to 64, so we make sure that we don't overflow that buffer.
To match that, length of the stack.
This is a really interesting view. So this is the first time we're seeing this here. This is called the filament view. This is something that was designed by DARPA specifically for this challenge to try to make the concept of a computer running a program something that the average person or even a technical person could see and understand a little bit better. So you are heavily involved in this. Why don't you describe what we're looking at?
I love the filament view. The filament view is a Hilbert curve. If you look at this plane, everything in this plane, as it kind of slides over time, everything in that XY, the X and Y of that plane, maintains locality. When you see, the same loop, looping over and over and over as X time goes forward there, that's a loop in code. It literally looks like a loop. And then later on, when you see a jump to different piece of code. Well, that's a jump to a different function, maybe a call or a jump, different part of a basic block, or more likely a function call, another loop that runs for a while. So you can see structures in the code. It's super interesting.
So what's this stuff over here?
Yeah, we've also got the memory plane, and this is something new that we haven't shown off in some of the earlier looks at it as much. The memory view shows reads and writes to memory pages. And now it's kind of flattened because obviously the memory space is very large, but it condenses down all the memory reads and writes. And so you can see things like as the stack grows, for example, recursively calling in other functions, potentially it's going to grow, or as it's adding onto a buffer, you can see those reads and writes look like that. You can also see when you read and write from the flag page, when you're trying to steal the flag data, those are kind of highlighted down that memory page. So we get a lot of information just by looking at that. And again, it also just lets us see sort of the overall structure of this filament. So if we let this kind of play out, this is disassembling. And so on the left, up in the corner, we've actually got the disassembly box itself, right? And so we can see these instructions, and we can see even the syscalls communicate, transmit and receives are actually shown here in the communication box. And then at the end, right here, we've got a crash. I do want to point out, too, that this is only for dynamic analysis. We don't operate statically in just a binary. We take an input and a binary together. And in this case, we can see up in the corner, the input was POV 408, and it's got the CGC logo. So that's a CGC POV.
Okay, that's the one that was created by the challenge author to prove that the software is vulnerable.
It's the reference. And no, this was never used in the game. Like, none of the competitors got to see this in use. We just use it to analyze things and to see, like, does this look like they patched the thing that we think they patched, or did they maybe patch something else? Or are they vulnerable to the thing we think they're vulnerable to? And then in this case, the binary that we're running here is the reference binary. So we can see that the reference exploit works against the reference binary. It is indeed vulnerable. The green dot by the binary shows that it successfully exploits, and the red dot shows that the binary itself failed and was successfully exploited.
Here we have the side-by-side view.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, comparison is where this is most effective. So on the left, we've got a reference, right? So this is the one that you wrote. This is the POV. So the same binary is being used. In this case, it's binary 648, which is the reference binary. All the teams are running it. But the POV on the left in the gray is the reference that you wrote. And the POV in the teal is actually from Xandra. So this is their POV compared to your POV, and we can compare the two of them really easily. We can sort of look back and see similarities and differences. So in this case, I'd say that certainly one of the first similarities that I notice is the sort of the shape and the structures. You see the same pattern of loops and processing. So there might be a read until there at the beginning where they're parsing the initial bytes that come in. They're copying some buffers as we see those sort of stair-step white. And now we can also see further off in the distance some other kind of parallel structures. We can tell that Xandra's POV is a little bit longer, but it does have the exact same overall shape and structure. We see the same functions being called, and we see the data being processed in the same order, although clearly there's some sort of record kind of in this that's being parsed, because I count about 10 of these kind of white stair-step memory reads out of the Xandra POV, whereas where I only see about 6 on the reference on the left. So again, a little bit of difference, but you can tell that they're actually hitting the same parsing structure. You can see the same code being hit, and they both caused that crash. You see the red dot on each of them, so both were successful POVs.
So Xandra was made by a team called TechX. TechX is a collaboration between Galactica and some researchers at UVA.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting collaboration. It's one of the few kind of true partnerships that we had in CGC. So it's fun seeing the commercial Galactica coming together with UVA, the educational research, because we tend to have teams that are sort of more one or the other. You've got the pure university approaches, and then you've got the pure kind of commercial, like in Raytheon. So it's fun to see that there was a team that kind of combined these two. I also like the story about them that during the qualifying round, they were sort of the first done. Which would mean even before the event was over, they said, "Okay, we're finished. Like we've submitted all of our results," and it was only like an hour into the.
So during the qualifiers, each team was given 24 hours to puzzle over the binaries.
So, and most teams, especially if you're fuzzing, if you're doing lots and lots, you just kind of keep fuzzing. You want to have it all, and they were like, nope, we're done. This is our results, and submitted it, and it was good enough to get it into the finals. So they were certainly right on that front. So that kind of is a good confidence.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It kind of means that maybe they have a different approach than some of the other teams.
That's kind of our suspicion, and certainly that they can have any kind of a quantifiable complete state is a really interesting statement about their capability.
Cool. Well, let's see how they do. So here we're looking at round 4. Round 4 is interesting because what we see now is last 2 rounds, a lot of teams have been down for patching. Now we get the opportunity to kind of take a look and see how their patches are performing. And one area I'm particularly interested in is the challenges that were already being scored against. So Rubeus was throwing a POV against everyone on Thermal Controller 2, and Xandra was throwing a POV against everyone on the SQL Slammer.
But we're seeing more patches, so a lot less successful POVs at this point. The other thing is interesting is that we're seeing a lot more teams, even though Xandra was certainly first there on the Slammer, we're now seeing a number of other teams also succeeding. So Rubeus is patching, but they're also still throwing POVs over there. So they've got their down for patching and also still scoring. So now that's actually a good thing to talk about, because when you're down for patching, you're not scoring points, right? You can't get any points for that service. So is there any value to doing that? Is that a bad idea?
There's a small amount of value, and what we can see is the teams they scored against. Let's see here. Rubeus scored on the yellow team, Jima, and then they scored on the blue team, Galactica. So what we see when we look at Jima and Galactica's hex tiles is that they don't have that white border around them. So that white border is indicating that a team is still protected.
Their security score is
still the maximum. So their Jima and Galactica, they both lost points on security for that challenge. So Rubeus didn't get any points out of it, but they were able to still somewhat harm their opponents.
A little bit. Now, in a perfect world, you do both. And of course, it does mean that they were leaking the capability. Although in this case, a number of teams are also throwing the same POV, or at least throwing successful POVs against the same service. So it's probably not like it's a secret, but there's certainly kind of this element of how much do you keep secret, and are you revealing a capability by using it against other teams? Although at this point, clearly the cat is out of the bag.
Definitely strategy is an important part of any CTF game. But we do remember that SQL Slammer, that was that really easy bug.
Yeah, so we're not surprised in that sense.
We're not surprised the other teams are finding it, but it is pretty cool that some of the teams have patched it.
We also still see that only Rubeus and Xandra are deploying their IDS rules along with their patches, and everyone else is just patching the binaries.
So let's take a look here in round 5.
And so we're just looking at all the POVs, right? Like we have views that we've shown before with this that have lots and lots of polls that kind of clutters up, makes it hard to see. But we're just looking at POVs. I want to remind folks that that's what we're looking at. We're not seeing polls.
Each cone being thrown in the arena here is one POV, and we don't visualize any of the polls because it was just absolutely too cluttered that way.
Although it did have the only advantage of that was it showed how complicated the game was, how much was going on, but it was just useless to learn about the game by watching.
Yeah, if you saw any of those games from the actual CGC broadcast, go back and watch it. It's on YouTube. It's very cool. But yeah, some of those views are overwhelming. What's really exciting here, and I don't know if you notice it right off the bat, but Jima has scored against network file system. Now, this is exciting because at this point in the game, every single CRS has thrown a successful POV against someone. That means every single one of these machines is actually playing the game, and that's huge.
And it's in the first 30 minutes. We're around 5 minutes around. Of course, we had around 0, so it's 30 minutes into the game, and every team has shown signs of life and putting up a fight.
Yeah, everyone can take a big, deep sigh of relief at this point. Nobody is sitting out there wondering, is it going to actually run? Is it going to fall on its face?
Are we going to have a 0 score? Are we never going to do anything?
And we know that the infrastructure is running on the back end, right? So this is a great moment for everyone. So Jima is actually interesting. Jima was written by CSDS, which is actually a 2-person team. It just absolutely blows my mind. 2 people, and everything that they did was written from scratch.
We decided we would start from scratch, or I decided I would start from scratch, and then Cindy started doing the same thing with the vulnerability, so that we could be specifically geared towards this challenge.
Yeah, 2-person, and not only 2 people, the smallest team in the competition, they came in as computer scientists, as certainly very, very clearly very capable, intelligent people. and I think approached it from a lot of these sort of first principles, and even in some instances didn't read the research because there's only so much time between either building up something of your own or reading research or adapting existing tools, and so it took a really interesting tack of trying to kind of recreate a lot of the technologies from sort of just understanding the basics of what they needed to achieve.
So back to the game. There's a really cool challenge I want to look at called Thermal Controller 2. And Thermal Controller 2 is a challenge written in C++. The idea is the code is representing a barbecue smoker. There's a special binary protocol going back and forth.
It's a very advanced barbecue smoker, and it's the third barbecue smoker in the game too, right? Because there was a whole series of thermal controllers.
This particular one is written in C++. It has a stack-based buffer overflow, and let's take a look at what that vulnerability looks like. So I want to step through this code, and if we look just at the top, we're talking about this read input function. This is where the binary is taking input off of the network and actually processing it. So first we see here in line 257, there is a stack buffer declared called input chars. Obviously, stack buffer, we're going to pay attention to that.
And of course, we got 512 bytes, right, to that
512 bytes long, yeah. So take a look at this while loop. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to read 1 byte into a character. Now, we're not reading into the stack buffer yet, but we're just taking 1 byte, and then we're comparing it to the sequence start byte that we're looking for. So that's we're looking for an A5. We compare it. If we do in fact get an A5, we go ahead and copy that character into our stack buffer, and that's important. We see position pointer being incremented there.
Yeah,
and
so this is a pretty typical kind of like network-based protocol. There's a lot of these like, sentinel flags and read bytes once you see that, start, stop kind of flags, that sort of stuff. That's pretty common in
absolutely.
network protocols.
A5, 5A, that's baked into, I think, Ethernet protocol. That's a pretty common sequence. So then we actually go look for the second one, and we're checking to see if it's the 5A. Now what's interesting here is if it is not the 5A, we see this statement here, go to begin. So if we match the first byte but not the second byte, we go back up to the top of the while loop. And what you'll notice is during that sequence, we incremented this position pointer, but we never reset it. So you can keep going through this loop over and over and over again and incrementing that stack buffer by 1 character at a time. And once you do it enough, you're going to go past the 512 that are allocated, and you're going to start writing over the other important areas of the stack.
And of course, unless the compiler changes the order of those arguments, the return address is going to be the next thing you're going to overwrite.
Yes, exactly. So the other thing we can take a look at is what was the original patch supposed to look like? So every challenge binary author had to create manually a patch to their code to say, yes, technically you can patch this and it will still function as normal. And what we see here is that the patch was in fact resetting that position pointer back to 0 every time you came back to the top of the while loop.
And no, that's not the required patch. They're not required to match that exact functionality when the teams submit their replacements. But their goal is to protect the vulnerability, if there are vulnerabilities, and to keep the original functionality. So there's legitimate polls that are being sent that they have to maintain, so they can't just break it and return 0 immediately. But if they can prevent POV from successfully exploiting them, then that's sufficient as long as they're passing polls and within performance characteristics, right?
And we wanted to see what did they do. So we took a look at some of these replacements. Now, several of the teams have patched this vulnerability. This is Crispy's replacement right here. Crispy's replacement did in fact patch a vulnerability. They made themselves, they mitigated the threat from that POV. What we're looking at here is on the left. We see some disassembly from the original binary.
Yeah, and I can even see that sort of this return address that we've got right here lines up with the move over here, right? Like that would have been the same thing. We can see that's the function epilogue on the left, and then it was the function epilogue on the right, and now they've added all this additional code essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. So all this extra code is what Crispy added to protect themselves. And what we see it doing is actually checking the return address on the stack against some expected values, and which are presumably the values from the program that are valid function pointers. And we see down here that If they determine that it is not valid, they're going to terminate, called the terminate system call. If they determine that it was valid, they're going to go ahead and just return like normal.
So this is, I mean, a fairly common implementation of a return address kind of protection validation. There's a lot of different examples of this. Control flow guard is a little more advanced where you're doing a lot of pointer validation, but for just return addresses, we see a couple of different techniques kind of in the wild. Stack cookies are a classic example of this, but this one, instead of inserting a stack cookie, it looks like they're just checking that return address before they return against the sort of whitelist that they've set up.
Dynamically checking that return address. And what we're going to see here is Crispy added this protection to almost every function that had a stack buffer. So it was like 60% of the functions in the program. And what you're going to see here in the filament is that because they added those protections, the execution trace is actually longer. Both of these execution traces are responding to the same input. So we're seeing here that is the reference POV is being thrown against both binaries. The reference binary on the left, bin 646, and Crispy's replacement, bin 678. So the reference POV was vulnerable, but Crispy's replacement wasn't. But because of those extra protections that they added in, we see the execution trace was longer. And as we'll see as the game unfolds, the performance of replacements is incredibly important. It affects the score, how efficient these replacement binaries are being. So here's Galactica's replacement. Galactica also had a patch that protected them from the POV. And what we see here is the same sort of thing. We're looking on the left. And this is where the function is exiting. We see the add 8 ESP, pop EBP, and we're going to correlate that to over here on the right, where Galactica's replacement is getting ready to exit this function, but they added their own special protection. I really like this one. It's very efficient. First, we're going to see them take the return address off of the stack. Then they actually dereference it and get the last 4 bytes before that address. And what that should be the end of the call function that was calling into this function. So what we should see if we look back at those bytes is we should see the address of the function that we're in. And they go ahead and check that. If it's correct, they let the function return like normal, and if it is incorrect, they call the terminate system call. Now again, kind of like Crispy, they sprinkled this protection all over the binary. Let's take a look at their filament. So here's the same reference POV being thrown against the original binary and Galactica's replacement.
So gray original reference, and then blue the Galactica replacement. So original crash.
Yeah, and we see the same sort of thing that we saw on the last one, which is that all these additional generic protections sprinkled all over the binary created a much longer execution trace than the original. So Xandra also had a replacement on this challenge, and their replacement did also mitigate the POV from Rubeus. Let's take a look and see what's different. So again, to get our reference here, with the original on the left, we're looking at the end of this function here. We got the add 18 ESP, pop EBP, and we're going to correlate that with what we see at the very top over here. So all of the code on the right that we see below this is all the part of the generic protection that's been added. And what I noticed right away here is that we have a bunch of floating point instructions that have been added. That's interesting. It provides the same mechanism. It's a generic protection for the return address, but using the floating point makes it a little bit more efficient as far as processing goes, and then it also makes it a little bit harder to reverse engineer. So let's see how this mechanism worked out for Xandra in the filament.
And again, so the important part here is they've got to maintain both memory and execution time performance constraints, right? So if they're using floating point and it's adding or removing a lot of memory, it can hurt them. Or if they're using a lot of extra instructions that take additional execution time, that can also hurt them. And I assume too that they're also generically applying this, right? Because we're seeing it not in one spot, we're seeing this like expanded out a whole bunch.
Again, yeah, and this one, it wasn't applied to quite so many functions, but it was applied pretty generically across the binary. The other thing we notice here that's interesting is that instead of exiting cleanly, this Xandra replacement binary actually crashed. Isn't that a problem?
Not necessarily, right? Because I said earlier, there's 2 types of POVs. You can either steal 4 consecutive bytes of the flag page, or you can demonstrate control as a POV. Now, what does control look like? Well, you say, I want to control these registers with this bit mask, and the game infrastructure says, that's fine, put these values into those locations, and so you've got to now sort of call your shot, demonstrate it, and crash with those particular values. So if the challenge set can patch itself to prevent you from controlling how it crashes, and it crashes in any other way, you no longer get points for it. Now, if they're not careful and they're crashing during normal execution, that's bad, right? But if they only crash...
Because you're going to lose availability.
Because you're losing
if you're
availability,
crashing all the time.
right. But if they're only doing it in the case of an exploit, that's actually fine. In fact, that's actually what some legitimate protection mechanisms in our current computers do. When you cause a Windows service to crash, it will actually just stop running. It says, no, I don't want to keep running. That's legitimate protection.
Yeah, as long as the vulnerability hasn't been exploited.
As long
right?
as it's not past the vulnerability's execution, yeah. Sometimes the crash occurs after the exploit's already run.
So now we come to Rubeus's replacement. Now, Rubeus is kind of special because they're the ones that found this bug to begin with. They started throwing their POV against everybody else.
We saw them exploiting everyone else at the beginning.
So we know that Rubeus knew exactly where this vulnerability is located within this binary.
So what we see from Rubeus's replacement is that they used the same generic stack protection mechanisms that we've seen before, but because they knew exactly where the vulnerability was, they only applied it to the one function that was actually vulnerable. Well, this resulted in a replacement binary that was by far the most efficient out of all the replacement binaries we saw.
And what we saw with their replacement is they actually only added protection mechanism to the one vulnerable function. So when you're looking here at this filament, you see very little divergence. It's almost the exact same execution trace. We've just added at the end, they've added a little bit of protection to just that one function. So this is a kind of a cool view. What we're looking at here is all those replacements that we just looked at. I just wanted to show they're all responding to the same POV. They're all protecting from that POV, but we have different approaches, and these different approaches lead to different execution traces, different performance metrics, and each replacement that we saw was patched in a different way, even though they were all effective.
Yeah, and even though they were sort of generic return address protections, they were exiting cleanly versus they were terminating versus they were applying it to all functions or one function. So there's still a lot of variance in how they can do it.
Yeah, it's very cool to start seeing some of these machines express personality almost. Yeah. Let's take a look at the scoreboard. So the first thing that is interesting to look at is the actual raw score for every team. We see here Mayhem is in first. They're at the top. They have the highest score. Rubeus in second, Xandra in third, Megafish in fourth, Gema, Galactica, and Crispy trying to catch up. So the other thing that we can look at when we're looking in this view is that each of these cells here represents one round. And we see the green, blue, and red lines, just like before in Arena View. The green represents availability, blue is security, and red is evaluation. So we can see from the very beginning of the game, going on through, we can see the progress of each team. And one thing to notice as we look is that the last few rounds, Mayhem has been extremely solid in all three categories. It's one of the reasons why they've risen up to first place. We also see Megafish has been very solid the last few rounds, but because early on they patched so many of their services, they really took a hit on availability, and they were actually in last place back then, and they've actually risen up to fourth.
So that tells us the trends over the 10 rounds so far. But if we really want to dig into kind of where they're getting their points, it's hard to see from the bar chart. So I'm going to kind of focus over here instead at the cumulative scores. These cumulatives have the gray, which is the total points each team has gotten. It has, again, the same as before, the green for availability, the blue for security, and the red for evaluation. But now they're sort of normalized to a maximum. So whichever team got the most availability, in this case it's Mayhem, they're the ones filling out the green to the maximum. Whichever team got the most on security, which in this case looks like Xandra actually, it's close, but I think Xandra's a little more than Rubeus. Yeah, they're really both close up there. But Xandra has the best security, and the best evaluation looks like right now it is coming from Rubeus, right? So we can see where each of these teams get their strengths, where they've gotten their points from. If we look at these scores, we can see a couple things about the different teams. We can see that, like I said earlier, Rubeus seems to have a pretty solid security and evaluation. Both are very, very strong, but they're suffering definitely on availability. In fact, their availability is getting worse over time, where their green line is sort of trending down. So if we actually watch theirs kind of going down over time. On the other hand, Megafish started off with their poor availability, and then they're improving. So what is a poor availability? It can be a couple of different things. Availability has two components. The first component is that you have to be properly executing the program. You have to keep the original functionality.
So you can't replace the binary with a simple shell script that just returns the network header.
Exactly. You can't just return exit, trivially quit.
I'm pretty sure that's a technique I've seen being used in other CTFs.
I've probably done it in another CTF, but a good CTF, you'd have polls, right? So, and you wrote some of the challenges. So what did your polls look like? How do polls work?
Yeah, so as a challenge binary author, one of the things we had to create were poll generators. So the polls for CGC are actually dynamically generated to make sure that they exercise all the functionality of the service. So each one is going to be different, but they all exercise the protocol, whether it's an ASCII-based protocol or a binary-based protocol, through all the different ways that the program can be used.
So we hope that it exercises all the functionality. It doesn't let somebody just remove part of the program. They have to keep the original functionality in. So the other part of availability is the performance characteristics. So if you run too slow, if you use too much memory, you're going to get a performance penalty. And the performance characteristics were tightened. During the qualifying round, you had about a 10% sort of margin of free points you could spend, I guess, or 10% performance penalty you could take before it impacted your score. But for CFE at the final event, you only had a 5% performance window. So it was much more sensitive. This is similar to Microsoft's Blue Hat Prize, where they say, we want you to come up with protections, but you can't just implement a whole virtual machine that re-implements the entire program and runs it 10 times the performance.
And why don't we want people doing that?
Well, because no one would use our computers, right? Like we have to actually have computers that are fast. If we make things secure but way too slow, nobody's going to use them. So that was an important criteria, that we wanted real-world fieldable defenses. Right? These had to be things that a user could use and they wouldn't be like give up and throw away the software because it was now too slow.
Yeah, and as we saw when we were looking earlier at the replacements, the teams that did generically sprinkle in those protections everywhere, they suffered score-wise.
They did, and so we can see that here actually. If you look in the availability of some of those teams that we highlighted using a large number of generic defenses, we're seeing their overall availability go down. So maybe they're still successfully answering the polls, which is great, but if the performance uses too much memory or takes too long, that's still going to hurt their availability, which we see.
And that's an element of CGC that was a little different. So back into arena view, here we have round 11. We're seeing a lot more scoring going on now, a lot of activity, so many different challenges being scored on. We're seeing POVs being thrown in every color, so every team is actively throwing POVs again.
And now just because we see a thrown POV doesn't necessarily mean it's a successful POV, right? So you could be throwing a POV that is just not actually succeeding.
Yeah, there's a couple of clues. We got to look for when the points go streaming back to the original, and then we can look here and see, after they've started tallying up, who has each team scored against. One thing that's really interesting here is we have Mayhem. Now we know Mayhem is in first, and if you want to wonder why, you can look at how many challenges they are scoring on. 6 different challenges Mayhem is actively scoring on right now. And 3 of these challenges, see if I can get them here. These 3 challenges, if you look across the board, nobody else is scoring on those 3 challenges. That means Mayhem has found the bug and crafted a working POV for 3 different binaries that no other team has been able to do. And 2 of them are actually heap exploits. So these are heap buffer overflows that Mayhem is exploiting in these challenges. And heap bugs aren't the easiest ones to exploit.
Heap is tricky, right? So we've talked a lot about so far about buffer overflows, and mostly stack-based buffer overflows, where you're overwriting either a return address, or you could, of course, write some other variable or something else on the stack. But the heap is hard, right? Because it's not this sort of linear kind of memory layout, but you have to control allocations, and that's what makes it tricky. So it's a little bit kind of like arranging boxes of various shapes and sizes. And so even if you can cause an overflow from one allocation to the next, trying to get them lined up in such a way that everything fits and that you can sort of call your shot and control something useful and interesting is not easy. You might be able to kind of get lucky into it, but usually it requires significant sort of intentional manipulation. So that's a really big bar for them to have hurdled, and to not have just 1, but 2. The other part about this I think that's fascinating is that these heaps are not standard heaps, right? Because everyone had to implement their own libc, their own allocators. That means this is not
a standard
malloc implementation, right, that are out
Right.
there. And so they had to have some sort of generic ability to detect this is an allocator, this is a free, and then model that. That's pretty cool to be able to successfully use that in a POV.
So Mayhem was written by For All Secure. For All Secure is a small cybersecurity company, but they have their roots in Carnegie Mellon.
For All Secure was founded several years ago from my grad students at CMU who really, I said, let's go work on automated exploit generation. And they went from this abstract idea to a working prototype. And we've grown by hiring more CMU students who are really into this hacker culture.
Carnegie Mellon with Plaid CTF, PPP.
Oh, the Plaid Parliament of
Parliament
Pwning.
of Pwning, yeah. They're one of the sort of rock star teams of the CTF community. They've been around for many years and have done very, very well, often many years leading the sort of this top scoring system in the CTF community. So it's not a surprise that they get CTF. And of course the research that comes out of Carnegie Mellon and Dr. Brumley, their lead, it's not a surprise that as he founded the company, that the company has this sort of strong academic but also practical CTF. They've got a lot of the right ingredients, certainly, to do well.
Well, we'll see if they can keep it up throughout the whole game.
Round 18, let's see what happens.
So over the last 10 rounds, we've seen some differentiation in the score. Some teams are still really struggling with the availability problem. They're kind of falling down. Some teams are staying really solid. Mayhem has done a pretty good job of just keeping everything up and running really solid. They don't suffer availability much from missing polls, and they really haven't been doing much patching.
Yeah, theoretically, they could be suffering from security if teams are actually POVing against them. But if there's not enough POVs being thrown or they're failing against them, then not patching is the right move, because then you don't have to take that downtime. And they're also actually, it looks like, having strong evaluation.
Do you modify your behavior, the CRS's behavior based upon what it's learning from or what it's receiving?
Yeah, the CRS changes, especially things like patching strategy based upon our score and based upon what it looks like competitors' scores are. So if we see something that seems to be doing well, we'll keep doing it. And if we're not doing well, we'll switch tactics.
Yeah, they're definitely doing a great job. They're scoring here on 6 different challenges still. No surprises why they're in first right now.
Yeah, and again, the highest evaluation in the game, of course, they're up at 17, and so their overall score is still looking really solid as well. Definitely a step up above everybody else by a large margin. For example, GMO, which is almost 1,000 points behind.
So here's round 22. We see right off the bat that Mayhem is scoring on a new challenge, the Corinth Challenge, scoring on at least 2 teams. We'll see how that goes. Just another page in their really strong offense.
And we are seeing, again, the same kind of strategies we've seen so far with Galactica, Rubeus, and Crispy all doing single patches. They're kind of rolling out patches sort of steadily. And then Shellfish, on the other hand, has got a larger number of patches where they've got 3 down at the same time. So they're definitely going to be paying the cost. And if the number of other teams that are throwing successful POVs doesn't increase, that'll probably be a downfall or be a painful strategy. But if their other scores are high, maybe it'll pay off.
So if there's like just tons of POVs being thrown left and right, then patching as soon as you find a bug, that's a solid strategy. In this game, we're seeing some offense, but we're not seeing like a massive amount of offense. 6 out of however many challenges are running right now actually getting POV'd. So patching all the time is turning out to be more of a hindrance than a benefit. So here in round 25, let's take a look at the scoreboard again. Mayhem still first. We obviously know why. Xandra, a solid second, trying to catch up, and then Rubeus in 3rd place.
Yep, we've got a little bit of a spread too, but there's still kind of anyone's within shooting distance, I would say, at this point. There's definitely a solid trend we've seen. At the beginning, we had a fair amount of kind of outages of these availability blips. It looks like for the most part, the green is what's going down. But Mayhem, of course, is solid on most things. And other than that one little spike there, their availability has been pretty strong, which is going to keep them in the lead so far, as it has with a decent lead, not quite a 10% lead compared to their competitors, but it certainly is a good buffer to have.
So let's move on to round 26.
So speaking of patching, I'm seeing Rubeus with a fair number on this one. This is probably the most they've had in any one round. We're seeing 4 services down, 3 of them with IDS rules as well as replacement binaries.
And then also, I
Yeah.
see something really kind of not so great happening right here. When we see these hex tiles shrink like that, that means the availability score is low. Now that might be because they're not answering polls properly, or that might be because they've taken too many resources with their replacement and they're getting penalized on either CPU or memory overhead.
We do see, for example, Galactica and Xandra have services as well with poor performance, but the cluster of 3 that Rubeus has really bodes ill. And of course, we do see their availability score is suffering significantly compared to the other competitors.
So round 27, I noticed right off the bat that Rubeus has patched here. They're down for replacements on a couple of the challenges, but it doesn't look like it's been enough.
Here it comes. No, in fact, it's actually
My
worse.
goodness.
Yeah, this is really going to hurt. So they're losing availability on all of the challenges except for 1 that are in play right now.
So this is catastrophic. Like the system is either under attack or it's failed in some like really massive way. Is this possible that this is like an offensive attack from someone else?
It certainly could be. I think that in sort of our planning and talking about it, the best case scenario as an attacker for you to damage your opponent is if you can steal a flag and then using code execution trigger either like an eBFE CPU spin lock, or you can allocate and free a bunch. You can cause the OS to thrash. You can actually impact the performance of the other services. The worst case that you can do that we found is if you have a corroborating POV to transmit and receive 1 byte at a time. You can actually do this unintentionally. In fact, during the sparring rounds, we actually had a similar situation where you can transmit and receive instead of large chunks of data 1 byte at a time, that this performance hit that you take as a result of doing that can cause trouble across all of your IDS rules, across all of your, and again, even if you're not deploying IDS rules, you still have an IDS system kind of in between. And so if even 1 rule is deployed, that can cause a problem.
So it's possible that Rubeus has done this to themselves. So they shot themselves in the foot.
It's possible that it's a sort of self-DOS, but it's also possible that it's an attack from a competitor. The hardest part about it is knowing sort of what triggered it, right? Like we don't know which of these services is the one that caused the performance. We don't think that all of their services have a problem. There's probably only 1, maybe 2, but a small number. Because even if it's an attack, it's got to be an attack that one of their opponents has a successful POV on. And so given the relatively small number of services being POV'd, it would have to be one that they can get code execution on. So.
Okay, well, let's see if the machine has been programmed properly to figure this out.
Yeah, how you respond to that's tough, right? Like, what do you put back? What do you patch?
So here in round 28, we are definitely looking at Rubeus is still suffering from some massive availability outage across almost all of their challenges. Now it looks like they are still replacing, so they're possibly looking for this problem.
Maybe they're going to try 1 service at a time. Maybe they're going to replace them all at once. And again, every time you do this, man, that availability hit, that is a huge, because they're multiplied together, remember.
Yeah, and their total score,
1,000
versus 3,000. I mean, so each round they're losing potentially 2,000 points of ground. That is going to hurt.
Yeah, it's really hard to kind of gain those points back by solving POVs. You really have to hope your competitors cause performance problems themselves, or maybe even if you can induce performance problems, because causing this availability hit is about the worst thing that you can do.
All right, well, round 29, oh, they have responded.
Yeah.
Rubeus taking some very drastic action here, replacing every single challenge they had in play that they had a replacement, they are putting back to the original.
Okay, and one of these is clearly the culprit, right? Because if we look at the performance for the remaining services, we are seeing that they're fine. They're not impacted by performance hits anymore.
Yeah, they're doing a lot better.
Rubeus patched something, and it really tanked the performance of the system. What might have happened?
So we found out that the network appliance that actually applies the IDS intrusion detection rule sets is shared amongst all the services. So we have a feeling that one of our IDS rule sets that we deployed as part of our patch set might have negatively affected the performance that apparently affected the other services that were fielded. So we have logic in place and our game theoretic component that will detect feedback coming back from the server when we know that a particular service is not performing well. And when that meets a certain threshold of low availability, we'll go ahead and retract that patch set and revert back to something that was performant. We'll essentially blacklist that patch set and revert back to something that we know is more performant.
Well, definitely. Well, I mean, that's pretty impressive. I mean, the machine found the problem.
It hurt
Whether
itself
they might
and
not know exactly what it was, but they knew it was something and they responded. That they could have been dead in the water for even longer.
Yeah, and the hard part is knowing which one of those services and what do you do as a result of that. Even as a human, that's a hard problem. I've had CTFs where I didn't know when I broke something, what I broke, or when the service polar caught it, and so I've had to go back and revert things that were probably good patches just because I wasn't sure what it was. And they might be vulnerable on some of these services now, but it's better than losing that huge hit to availability. Although it is worth pointing out, some of the other teams have availability problems too.
But definitely not that massive across-the-board failure like we just saw with Rubeus. Well, let's take a look at the scoreboard and see how
Yeah, I want to
this
know how
has
that
affected
impacts
them.
them. Let's see. They were standing strong in third there for a bit beforehand.
So before this outage, Rubeus was in third. They have fallen. They have fallen to fourth place.
And that's a pretty big gap,
73,000
too.
points. I mean, that's a big gap between third and fourth right
Yeah,
now.
they're down by again almost 10% in terms of total score.
Yeah, and we can see here how that green line really dipped the last few rounds.
Yep.
That is going to hurt.
And even Crispy had a sort of smaller dip as well at the same time, but not nearly as hard, not nearly as far. And we're definitely seeing a trend where your sort of overall score is best predicted by your availability. That seems to be the key so far, and the key to Mayhem's strength has been solid security, solid evaluation, but most importantly, solid availability.
You were battling it out with Rubeus for a while, and now you've actually firmly taken lead with an 8,000 point lead.
Yeah, we're very excited to start building up a lead. I think our strategy to patch very carefully. We try to infer when teams are attacking us and only patch when we think someone is exploiting us. In that way, we don't incur the issue where our patch is not performant enough.
I see.
And we don't lose availability scars.
So we mentioned a few times with generic patching versus like a scalpel-like approach.
Right.
What do you employ both?
We do. We really try to field an agnostic patch that would protect against any vulnerability, in theory. It has been our experience that most binaries have multiple vulnerabilities, and we were worried that we would patch one, like find and patch one, and another team would find another, and then we would have to patch twice, which is very expensive.
So really exciting. Megafish has come from. I mean, they were in last place
at the
early
very
on in the
beginning,
game,
yeah.
and now they're in third. What a climb! I wonder how they're feeling.
And this is their response. Their team tweeted out this in particular to show how excited they were to be rising. And again, as a reminder, third, second, and first are the money-winning spots, so it's a good place to be.
So Shellfish is a really fun team. We've known them throughout the CTF circuit.
Yep.
They've been around for a while.
Very long time, yeah.
Very good attitude.
I mean, Shellfish in general, of course, is quite old. I think we're the oldest CTF team now that kind of still exists. We always play in a lot of CTFs, and when the CGC was announced, the thinking was like, holy cow, this is the future of hacking, right?
This was hilarious.
They owned me, actually. This was kind of fun. So not only did they try to hack their opponents, but one of the things they did actually broke our visualization system. So the system we use to generate traces that we use to show the filament view was based on QEMU. And the QEMU virtualization system, emulation system, is not the best at floating point.
So here's that code from Megafish that was causing the problem. We see here that they have inserted some floating point instructions kind of early on in their binary.
Yep, and QEMU is not great with floating point, unfortunately. We actually found and fixed at least one bug beforehand, but we didn't catch them all, apparently. Software's hard. And so this was, it made it impossible to analyze with our visualization engine the binaries. Thankfully, that was not what the game was running on. The game infrastructure was completely separate from the visualization and was not based on something like that, but rather a native hypervisor.
But it's kind of reasonable to maybe guess that some of the CRSs might have actually been using QEMU.
I would definitely assume that at least one of the teams had QEMU under the hood.
So
it's
if they
very
were
common.
performing some consensus evaluation on a replacement from Megafish, they're going to run into the same problem.
They're not going to analyze it. Yeah, absolutely. It's going to get here and it's just going to stop. You're going to see no more code at that point from the analysis engine if it tries to run it. And something like QEMU is really helpful because you can add data flow, you can add instrumentation kind of out of band where you can monitor for reads from the flag page. You can do a lot of nice things with that. In fact, that's why we're able to do some of those things with the visualization engine, how we can show the flag pages in yellow when we highlight the memory view, and some of those views are based on that underlying technology. So it's helpful to have, but if you can frustrate analysis, it makes it harder for your opponents.
And we saw some other forms of anti-analysis in the game too. This is a replacement from Galactica. What Galactica did that is interesting is they obfuscated the entry point to their program. They dynamically calculated it at runtime. So if you're doing any kind of static analysis on the binary, and you can see over here that no functions have been disassembled.
Because it starts at the sort of libc start, which is the entry point of the file, the CGC file format itself, which is similar to ELF. And so it starts at start, starts running down, and this is dynamically computed. And so when the program's running, it'll just compute it and jump right into main, no problem. But if you don't find that, and you don't have some sort of kind of linear sweep to try to guess and identify where functionality is at, your analysis is going to be stalled out.
Here's another one that's kind of a favorite to look at. This is a replacement from Rubeus. And Rubeus figured out early on, I guess in some sparring rounds earlier in the competition, that there was a noticeable way to fingerprint that you're actually running on CGC infrastructure. And that's using the CPU ID instruction. Because the system had been modified to emulate one particular environment, the CPU ID instruction on the challenge infrastructure always returned the same exact value.
I mentioned earlier there was a hypervisor for the native system, and one of the side effects of that was to sort of fix the environment. So even as machines were swapped out or moved, that the running environment of CGC would be as predictable as possible. And so as a side effect of that, it had a hard-coded string for the text value. You can actually use the CPU ID instruction, and you get back a bunch of values. One of them is like a string, like the Intel whatever CPU, so it gives you the model of the CPU. And that information, they were able to not only detect during sparring, but then build in a system into their CRS so that it could detect if it was actually being running on that same hardware. And if you tried to run it elsewhere and you didn't exactly match that environment, they could behave differently.
Yeah, and so they went ahead and did. What we're looking at here is the same binary. Later on, after they detect that CPU ID, they decide if they're not running on challenge infrastructure, they go to this code here. And what they're doing here is actually what we've been calling a honeypot or a honey branch. We see some syscalls, and this one right here in particular, this is a receive syscall that's actually receiving onto the stack.
And it looks like a receive loop where it's going to loop around multiple times, reading kind of one byte at a time into the stack. If you're a competitor CRS, this looks just like a stack-based buffer overflow.
Yeah, a really simple
easy one. So hypothetically, you could see this, you could analyze it, and if you don't realize that this is never going to go here on the legitimate CGC infrastructure, you think, hey, that's a much easier flaw than anything else I might find, and you might throw a POV against this instead.
So we actually were hearing just about some dirty tricks or evasion techniques. Does Rubeus employ any of these style of gameplay things?
It tries to make things difficult. It does, yeah.
Are there any specifics that you could go into?
Sure. I mean, you could probably take one of our binaries and try to open it up in a typical analysis tool, and it may or may not work.
Nice.
And if you want to run it, you probably ought to run it in an environment that looks an awful lot like the official system. It should only run where it's supposed to be running.
Yeah, this is a great technique. It actually worked pretty well. The dev team noticed it even during the game, and then I think did some analysis to see how effective it was as a technique.
And a number of other competitors, we saw submitted POVs from other competitors that specifically targeted this flaw. And so it will work if you test it locally on non-CGC infrastructure, but in the game environment, it would never actually run.
So here's round 33. This is a somewhat interesting round in the game.
I do see a variety of POVs right off the bat, actually. There's a lot of color. That's a good sign that we're seeing a number of different teams attempting POVs, at least.
Yeah, so let's talk about POVs a little bit. We mentioned that there's type 1 and type 2 POV. The type 1 POV is the first step of code execution. You have to crash a program in a controlled manner with user-controlled data in EIP and one other general-purpose register. And then you have the type 2, which is the memory leak. We have the infrastructure loads a page of memory and fills it with random but pre-known data, and then the the attacker has to get that data out somehow. Now, it could be a traditional memory leak, or they could actually use code execution to read that memory and have it transmitted back out over the wire. Why would you go through all that trouble if you already can just crash and get execution?
Well, it's a lot harder to detect a memory leak or getting code execution, exfiltrating data. That's much more difficult for an automated analysis system to pick out. Now, it is a little bit easier in the sense that it's at a fixed location. The magic page doesn't move around. So if they have an analysis engine, like I mentioned earlier, when you've got QEMU and you might be able to tag that data and do some kind of data flow on it, it might make it easier. But that's again why some of these competitors made analysis difficult on their binaries, so their competitors wouldn't be able to put them in their analysis frameworks. But presumably teams could instrument their own binaries, run all of the POVs, network data through them, polls through them, and try to figure out which ones it can get to the magic page. Reliably doing that is an important part of the game, because then you can know when you need to defend yourself if you're actually being successfully POV'd, and you might also be able to turn it around. Sometimes the best team is not the one that finds the exploit, but that can quickly reappropriate it.
So I want to take a look at this POV here by Galactica, and we have a video of the filament. So here's this POV just being thrown against the reference binary. This is everybody's running the service when it comes up. This one is pretty interesting from Galactica because they actually construct a ROP payload.
Okay, nice. So a ROP payload, of course, return-oriented programming, right? So it started with ret to libc, but the idea is that instead of running your shellcode, you're just reusing snippets of code that are in the existing binary. It's the classic way around protections like NX, which won't let you run data. It properly separates code and data. So instead, you use your data to point on the stack to different values in the original code segment, and then kind of reuse that code.
Okay, so what I like about this POV here from Galactica is they actually, they went and found a couple of different ROP gadgets in the code. They had to readjust the stack, then they dropped into transmit with the flag page data already, on the stack. And we see here that in fact this POV was a type 2. We can tell by this little flag icon it was a type 2 and was successful. And then we also see that the binary exited cleanly. So after they did the transmit, they also cleaned it up. They put the exit in their ROP chain. They put an exit syscall.
And if you're writing an exploit payload, like cleanup is actually kind of one of the challenges. Sometimes you can create an exploit, but you can't exit cleanly afterwards, or you can't reliably resume execution. So that's actually kind of a human skill that's fairly difficult, and not all exploit writers will even bother to do.
So the question I have then is, was this somehow pre-canned? Did they already have it set up? And I have the answer to that here, because we have a different version of this POV. This is the same challenge they're throwing against, but if you look up here, you can tell this is Xandra's replacement binary.
Okay.
So this is not the original binary. This is another team, CRS, has replaced it with this one. And what we see happening here is Galactica, they still succeeded, okay? They modified this POV. It's still using a ROP payload. They succeeded. They had to adjust that stack offset. This time, they didn't clean it up. So you can see that they didn't go through with the with putting the extra gadget on the end of that. I don't know why.
Maybe they didn't have room?
Obviously, yeah, it's been dynamically generated, so for whatever reason.
And so to be clear, it's the same POV. So the same binary, the CRS generated the binary, submits a POV, and that POV is able to calculate based on what it needs to, the proper offsets, and it's still able to succeed even in the face of a different target.
So let's talk about Galactica. Galactica was written by the team Codejitsu. Codejitsu is made up of a bunch of academic researchers. So some from the University of California, Berkeley, some from Syracuse University, and they came together and built this CRS.
Yeah, and they've got a mix of CTF players. I, of course, always like to highlight who's got, folks on the CTF scene. A number of their team members were part of CTF team. And also Don Song is one of the kind of predominant researchers in the field. I think if you look at sort of a majority of the relevant literature in automated exploitation, automated patch generation, a lot of these things are things that her and Dr. Brumley as well have had their fingers in. So she's, it's not at all surprising to see her involved in a team that's developing and fielding these technologies.
We combine static analysis, dynamic analysis, symbolic execution, and we combine fuzzing, smart fuzzing, all these different approaches that really help each other. They can help us to extract intelligence from the program binaries in different aspects, in different angles, and then we combine all this information, all this intelligence, then use it to help us to find vulnerabilities in the binaries as well as harden the binaries to make it secure against the attack. So it's really about how we can combine all these different techniques. In the past, we all have done actually research in each individual area, and this actually is one of the first times where we really combine all these different techniques, bring them together to get, you can say the sum is greater than, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
So here's a really cool challenge. This challenge is called snail mail, and this is a traditional memory leak style vulnerability that's embedded into here. The application itself is emulating an old-fashioned post office.
It's like the Pony Express.
You can send a message and get a stamp and things like that. And what we're going to see is the memory leak happens when you get a stamp. It leaks information from the flag page. And you know, we talked last time about ROP and why that's important to get around a NoX stack. The other piece of the puzzle is having a memory leak, right, to get around ASLR. So modern binary protections move things around in memory. You don't know where they're going to be, so you don't know what address you need to put into your ROP payload to get it to actually execute.
So there was no type 1 POV that we know of anyways possible in this binary. It was purely a type 2 POV based on manipulating the system to give you a letter back, and not just one letter, right? You had to get 2 in a row because there was only 3 bytes per serial number that you got.
Let's take a look at it here.
Yeah, so it wasn't just a matter of send a letter, get the number, and realize that those 4 contiguous bytes came from the flag page. You had to think about it a little bit, right?
Yeah, there's a little bit of reasoning involved, which is pretty cool. So here...
Yeah, what are we looking at here?
Okay, so here we're looking at the reference POV. So in gray, the author's intended exploit for this binary. And if you look down here on the memory view, one thing that's very cool is any read from the flag page is highlighted in yellow. And we can see it right here really clearly. 3 bytes, individual bytes coming out of the flag page.
Yeah.
And as we said before, you have to do this twice because to score on a type 2 POV, you need 4 bytes of flag page data. So you have to basically interact with the service, ask it for 2 separate stamps, get these 6 bytes of flag page data, and then realize how to put them together. And what we're going to see here next to this in purple is Mecafish's POV. So Mecafish CRS actually figured this out, and we can see the same sort of thing, and it's a little blurry there, but the same sort of thing happening where they've on 2 separate occasions interacted with the service and got these stamps issued. So they have this flag page data. And then we definitely can see here, if you look, that this was a type 2 POV and it was successful. So they figured out how to put these bytes together and they scored. And they're the only team to do this on this service. Here we are at round 39.
Is this going to be an interesting round? Are we looking for a particular?
We're seeing some POVs be thrown. Nobody is actually scoring. We have somewhat interesting, Mecafish is down for patching on the Outlaw service right here. Absolutely nothing else really going on.
I see some availability problems for Crispy and Jima and one of their services and a little bit on Xandra. But I think what's most interesting is what's not happening maybe, right?
Yeah, so we see these POVs have been getting thrown, and throughout the game, a few of the teams throw POVs all the time, no matter what. We call these kind of chaff POVs. CSDS has a what we call the Swiss Army knife, and Rubeus just had like a generator that just kind of made noise.
Yeah, I mean, I've done this in CTS too. Like as soon as I have an exploit or I know I'm getting close to having a successful exploit, I start just generating other traffic against that service.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if the only thing I send, is the exploit, it's too easy to see. And now in this case, we have lots of polls as well, but it's still a good idea to always kind of be sending stuff. It's definitely not a bad idea.
Yeah, but what we see not happening is Mayhem. They are one of the teams that has been throwing these chaff POVs from the beginning, and for the last several rounds, they haven't generated anything new. So it is somewhat interesting. The default behavior of Mayhem seems to have been throw something no matter what, even if you don't know how to exploit it.
Even if it won't work, yeah.
And that hasn't been happening. So we're gonna have to take a look and see what's going on with them. So here's the scoreboard at the end of round 39, and we can see, as we expected, Mayhem is still up in first place. They've still got a pretty substantial lead on Xandra. Mechafish and Xandra, they've been battling it out. The last few rounds, Mecha actually popped up to second for a couple of rounds, and then it kind of came back down to third. But they're just neck and neck here. I mean, separated by 300 points. I mean, that's just like
easily
one
to
challenge.
happen in one round. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Literally one challenge could do it.
Yeah, so the other thing that's interesting about the end of round 39 here is this is the point at which the game became viable. There was a predetermined number of rounds that DARPA decided if we don't get this far, then the game doesn't happen. We're not going to award prize money because we didn't make it happen. So this was a huge deal. We actually made it happen. I mean, everyone's clapping behind the scenes, and the dev team's very excited that their part of everything held up, and I'm sure all the teams are very excited that their CRSs actually played the game. So this was a huge accomplishment. Now the game is still going to go on for a while. The second criteria was we had a time. We wanted to run for 9 hours. So how many rounds can we get in successfully in 9 hours? And we're going to see that the game does go on from here. Moving on to the game, here's round 40. Now remember round 39, the only thing interesting that happened was Mechafish was down to patch this one service. And now we're up here in round 40, and oh man, it is not looking good for Mechafish.
I've seen this before, yeah, we know what this looks like.
Yeah, deja vu.
Right. So just like Rubeus had their little instance earlier where one patch looks like it impacted all of the services. Although at the time with Rubeus, it was not as easy to identify which one it was because they were kind of doing a couple of different things. But here, yeah, it's very clear. We have Mechafish patching one service. The very next round, everything is taking a hit. You can see that diminished availability across all of the services. And as the scores count up, yep, sure enough, very, very low availability. And again, that hurts so much because that's multiplied across all the other possible points. And even though they had a great security score of 30, they had tied for the best security score that round, it's not going to do them much good.
And they were getting so close to second.
Yeah, they were just getting right up there, nipping at the heels. And this is definitely going to impact them.
Well, let's see how long it takes them to figure it out.
Yeah, much like with Rubeus, we had the same question. How quickly are they going to respond? Are they going to be able to identify what caused it? What's the reaction going to be? And how many rounds will it take?
See? Well, we see here they certainly don't seem to have noticed what's going on. They're down for patching on another service, not the one we want to see them fix.
Not the one that we want to see them fix, yeah.
And yeah, availability across the board just really taking a hit.
And they are getting some POVs though. We can still see them actually getting POVs. Those points aren't going to help them much though, unfortunately, because again, that diminished availability. But they in fact look like the only team that had successful POVs that round. Not that it will do them any good, unfortunately.
Not doing them much good score-wise, but it is impressive, even though their system is down and under this load, that they're still valiantly trying to score points. And we'll see the availability add up there, and they are taking a big hit. Their total
Another round with a half or a third of the points of everybody else, yeah.
Oh, and here we go in round 42. Mechafish taking some decisive action. Now, they didn't need to patch all of their services. They only needed to fix this one that we know is broken, but they went ahead and pulled everything they had in the game. That's very similar to what Rubeus did.
Yeah, it's a very difficult problem to try to analyze. In the case of Rubeus, I'm not even sure I would have been able to easily pick it out because there were multiple things being patched. In Mechafish's case, it's a little bit more obvious. If I'd been the human doing it, I might have been able to figure it out. But it's not at all surprising that the reaction is everything's broke, put it all back.
You got to do something. Yeah. It's nice to see that they were able to respond in just 2 rounds. So.
And yeah, exactly. That was a little faster too. I think we saw Rubeus, and because it was a little muddled as to when it began, it was probably harder for the system to diagnose and identify it. But I guess we should see next round them coming back up with better availability, though this cost them heavily.
So there we go in round 43. Mechafish is back up and running.
Back up, and this time we're not expecting to see, since they did replace the problematic service, we're expecting to see it come back up, and sure enough, we're not seeing diminished availability across other services. And finally,
You're finally going to get those points.
They're going to get those points. They've been for 3 rounds now trying to get those, but this is the one that's going to do it.
They're scoring pretty solidly on this challenge.
That's a good one too. They were the only one, and even though that they were throwing that POV earlier, no one else was able to detect that and either patch to defend against it or replay it against other competitors as well.
Yeah, that's pretty good showing for them. And their score is back up in the running.
Yeah, still with those 3 services down.
Yeah, we'll see. Hopefully that didn't hurt them too bad.
We know Mechafish took a hit, so let's see the results. And sure enough, the scoreboard definitely shows it. That big dip right there. So that outage absolutely cost them. And of course, the difference in score we've got a pretty big margin. Remember, they're only, how many was it before? They were pretty close to second place before.
They were 300 points behind Xandra.
Yeah, only 300 points. And now, unfortunately, 5,000 points difference there, and there's still over 9,000 points between Xandra and Mayhem as well. So a little bit of a gap there, but much more of a spread now in the top 3 than we had before.
Now I want to take a look at the mail server challenge. This is one of the rematch challenges. Everyone's kind of been waiting for us to talk about this.
And we don't call it mail server.
Okay.
We call it
Crack Adder. Yeah. So this challenge had a vulnerability in it. It's a vulnerability in SendMail. It's been around for a very long time. And in 2011, Halvar Flake had a presentation and brought it up as something that program analysis was just not able to solve because of the nature of the bug, and kind of threw down the gauntlet and said, hey, we've got to get better at program analysis. We've got to be able to statically analyze and find these types of bugs.
That was the original, right? But then Halvar had his own smaller, kind of more optimized version of it, right?
Yeah, so his example that he used as the sort of distilled down essence of the bug. That was only about 60 lines long, and even that was something that was too complex for static analysis to handle because of the state space explosion problem. The parsing loop was so deep, there was just no way to get at it with a modern system. But what we've done here is kind of gone back to the original. This is not as simplified as Halvar's version. It does have more of the components from the original Crack Adder function from SendMail. It's not exactly the same. One thing that we'll see that's different is I used some ASCII characters instead of the angle brackets and things like that. I didn't want any of the teams to have a leg up.
Well, and part of that comes from the edicts sort of the organizers and the rules for challenge binary authors to not recreate public protocols, right? We didn't want teams to have a sort of head start or a leg up just because they happen to be good with email or HTTP or any existing protocols. It had to be fresh. So even though this code is very, very similar in the structure and the state and the flags and pointer tracking, the actual protocol itself looks different.
Yeah, it's important to point out, maybe if it's not obvious to people, but every challenge that was written for this game is original code. It's using original protocols, and every single vulnerability is a zero-day vulnerability. We went to great lengths to keep all this code secret before the competition.
And it looks like we have some data. Basically, Mechafish was the only team to actually successfully POV against our version of Crack Adder. So this basically represents a leap forward in program analysis. For them to be capable of doing this means that we're one step closer to that thing that's basically been sort of the Everest of program analysis because of that state machine problem.
So behind the scenes, the scores come out. We say, oh, Mechafish scored on Crack Adder.
Great. Maybe. Yeah.
Can we double check that?
Yeah.
Was it an unintended vulnerability? Did you accidentally put a stack buffer overflow at the beginning?
Because we did see a large number of the vulnerabilities were not necessarily the one the author intended. For the vast majority of the competition, that's perfectly fine. That's as intended. We know that humans can't write perfect code. That's why we had it in the first place. But for this one, we really wanted it to be real.
You guys successfully patched Crack Adder, but I believe you also were the only one to exploit it, right? And so congratulations. That's pretty. Halvar Flake actually considered this like the Everest, as Vizzy calls it, of challenges. Congratulations. What do you think about this?
It's pretty overwhelming.
Right?
Wow. I mean, all the talk about state machines and all the possibilities of state machines really reminds me of one of the papers that we published recently. We're an academic lab. We publish papers. That's what we do. We published paper Driller, which is supposed to augment fuzzing with symbolic execution. And it's one of our really in-depth case studies talks about how exactly it traverses the state machines and is able to really explore deeply parts of the program that would normally be inaccessible to a more naive approach.
So I see good news here at the end. We see a crash at the end, so that means potentially that they succeeded. And then more importantly, yes, we see that from the results field there in the API, we know that we're getting a successful POV against the reference. We saw the depth, so we know they scored against everybody. So well done, Mechafish.
That was so exciting because I've worked so hard on this system, and to know that we can do stuff that no other team can, even if we didn't win, that's an awesome feeling. It's great.
I think my absolute favorite story of this particular event, and this is one that we were, I would say, most wanting to see. We really want to see a kind of action-reaction type of flow. We want to be able to see, will the machines do things kind of back and forth, or are they all going to play blindly?
Are they actually responding to each other, or are they just going through some sort of automated protocol.
Right, because they can react at speeds that no human can, and that's what makes this the most interesting aspect of the event, is the speed at which the machines can react.
So we just saw this excellent score from Galactica. This is the on sale challenge. And it looks like they just scored against every other team.
Everybody except for
Mechafish, who's down right now patching.
And this is the one time Mechafish's preemptive patching worked in their favor, right?
Yeah,
so
sometimes they get the timing right.
They got it right here, and they just happened to get lucky. They submitted their patch the same round that Galactica submitted their POV, and so the binary is down, which prevents them from getting proven against. But everybody else, Galactica scores on. So
I want to take a look at this POV from Galactica. What we're looking at here is just a Wireshark capture. So we capture the packets going back and forth between Galactica and the service, the on-sale challenge, and we see Galactica's traffic in red, and then the service responding in blue.
And then this is the service that everyone's running. It's the reference unpatched binary that all the teams are running at the start, except for Shellfish, who had it down.
Yeah. Now the vulnerability in this challenge allowed a function pointer to be overwritten. And what we look at in the traffic right here, we see BAAAAE1. That is a stack address. It actually happens to point back up, at runtime, it's pointing back up to the beginning of this payload here, which is where they have their shellcode.
So this buffer is loaded onto the stack, the function pointer does the overwrite, and then when it calls that function, it's going to just start executing shellcode directly on the stack.
Yeah, and I have another graphic here we can look at. So this is that shellcode from Galactica that's just disassembled. The one thing that you probably noticed in the Wireshark dump is that it was all printable ASCII. That's one of the reasons why we see a lot of this processing going on here with these long immediate values, because they have removed all null bytes and they have actually removed any non-printable characters from this really neat payload.
Yeah, it's a common technique. You see a lot of ASCII-safe shellcode encoders. What I like about this one in particular, though, is right there at that start, that push EDX. That's really cool because it means they're using the context of the program at the moment of the crash or at the moment of that function pointer overwrite as a part of their payload. It makes it much more difficult to analyze in isolation. You actually can't decode what these values are without knowing what that existing register was at the moment of the crash. So that means it raises the bar significantly for the opponents if they want to try to figure out what it's doing.
And it definitely wasn't pre-canned because it depends on program state
very
where they
specifically
inserted
on
it.
that POV, absolutely.
And we see at the end, these in80s, these are syscalls. First, it's calling transmit with the address of the flag page. And one thing that you don't see in any of the shellcode is the address of the flag page.
Because the flag page itself is not ASCII printable, so it has to be computed if they want to use ASCII safe shellcode.
Absolutely, and that lets them get around that IDS rule that we've seen from Rubeus and Xandra in the past.
We've seen teams,
they
just hard-coded block that address in any kind of network traffic, which could have had false positives, but also would have stopped sort of naive payloads that just immediately try to transmit that. So that's a very nice shellcode payload.
After that great scoring round in round 51, we see 3 teams now have decided to react and patch.
We are employing a variety of static analysis and dynamic analysis techniques that are fast. So if we can identify statically that a flaw exists, we'll immediately release a patch for it. Additionally, too, if we can find network traffic that we expose the vulnerability based on the form of attack, we can automatically patch it. So I believe that those two combined factors probably led us to patch quickly.
So now that we see in round 53, the replacements that they just submitted are all up and running.
And we don't yet see any successes, so Galactica looks like they weren't successful against any of those yet. Let's wait to the end of the round. One more from Jima. Okay, so it looks like the same number of vulnerable competitors, just Jima and Mayhem, who we know haven't patched.
So all of those replacements were effective. Now, one thing that wasn't super effective is Crispy's replacement right here. They're suffering unavailability.
Yeah, so they were defended, at least. They prevented the POB from being successful, but at, unfortunately, a greater cost. You never want to impact your availability.
So back to that back and forth story. We talked about how Galactica scored against Rubeus, and Rubeus submitted a replacement. So this is the replacement from Rubeus. What we see Rubeus doing in many of their replacement binaries is they have an allocate here with a random size that moves around data on the heap. Then they do this allocate right here that's the same size as the stack, and immediately after that they stack pivot, basically. They reassign the stack to this newly allocated area of memory. And what is really important to understand is that the parameter that they sent into the allocate function makes that new area of memory non-executable.
Excellent. So they've set the page permissions on that memory. I've written stack pivots before, but never in a program, usually for shellcode, right? When you want to kind of pivot your stack and get a clean stack to work with. But that's a cool trick there where they're able to modify the stack. And then, as you said, they set the permissions so that it's non-executable. That's a common technique on most modern operating systems. It wasn't in the base decree, but the API allowed for it. The syscalls would let you make a page non-executable, and that's a very nice, clean technique. So they didn't patch the vulnerability. They didn't fix that pointer overwrite that we saw.
Yeah, and we know that they obviously didn't find it either because they're not throwing a working
That's
POV.
true. So,
but they were still able to defend using this technique.
They may have been able to detect what it was, or maybe they had some evaluation, or maybe got lucky. But all we know is that we see them submit this the same round that the POV is being thrown, and it precisely targets a feature of the exploit that we were seeing thrown from Galactica.
So next round, 54 here, we see Galactica changing up the POV, just the one that they're throwing against Rubeus. And there you have it. They just scored on Rubeus with a new POV. This is the same, Rubeus is still running that same binary that we saw before that has an NX stack. So obviously this is not the same payload that they were throwing before.
So because of consensus evaluation, when Rubeus submits the replacement that had their protection in it, it goes to all the other teams as well. So the other teams have the chance to analyze it and say, I think that this needs to be, I think I can work around this, or I think I find a flaw in this. And so Galactica has submitted a replacement POV that only targets Rubeus. It's a replacement for that one team and one team only.
Yeah, and let's take a look at it and see what's different. Again, this is a Wireshark capture, just like before. The traffic from Galactica is shown in red, the traffic going back is shown in blue, and in the same location, we see before we were seeing the function pointer being overwritten with a stack address. Now it's being overwritten with an address within the binary.
Yeah.
So that's a RUP gadget.
Yep. So they're going to reuse some part of the original binary that was there. So it has to be executable because it's a part of the original code section. You can't make that non-executable.
Yeah. So it's getting around the non-executable stack.
And this is typical, right? Anytime you're writing an exploit against a non-executable stack or any kind of area, you use ROP, right?
Yeah.
You return-oriented programming, you get around it with that.
It's a technique you have to use. So we see up here, after it readjusts the stack, we see a few other ROP gadgets being called. And then really interesting right here is the address of the flag page.
That's the flag page right there. I always look on the right side first and look for that CG. that's your hint, right? It's the CG as well as the C0. That's it. That's the flag. So they directly hard-coded the value of the flag page in this time, which they avoided before, right? They were
obfuscating it, yeah, right. with their shellcode.
But the new payload was able to get around the NX stack at the sort of expense of having to hard-code that flag page in there. But this is successful. We saw it work against the defenses that Rubeus fielded.
Yeah, so it's really neat to see the machines going back and forth like that, patching and then reacting to the patch.
And of course, we're speculating a little bit because we don't know exactly what the machines were responded to or how they do it. All we have to measure them on is the actions they took. But certainly the fact that Galactica targeted just Rubeus with the only one with a specific POV that changed how it worked to evade the one protection that Rubeus applied is indicative.
And now, in round 55, Rubeus is busting out their IDS rule.
Right, so they were on one of only two teams. We know Xandra and Rubeus deployed IDS rules, not heavily and not complicated IDS rules, but one of those IDS rules was one that just blocked the magic page, right?
Yeah, that was the predominant rule in use, was if the POV is sending traffic that has the flag page address in it, block that traffic.
So it's sort of the simplest pattern match, just hard-coded value. It's like antivirus of your that is like the easiest to evade and avoid.
You'd think it would mess more things up than it would solve.
Yeah, you could.
And they do use it sparingly.
You could easily false positive if there just happened to be those bytes in the payload, or if a challenge binary author included that address.
Yeah, and so it turns out that throughout the rest of the length of the on-sale challenge, Galactica never again scores against Rubeus.
So that was it. That Rubeus had the final say.
They took out their code execution with the NX stack, and then they took out their ROP payload with the IDS rule.
Yeah, this is I think the most important story of the whole thing, as I said earlier, because not only is this automated attack and defense back and forth, but it's happening so fast. This happened in the minimum time possible. These rounds are 5 minutes long. And oftentimes in the same round where the data is being exposed to them, they're responding, which means we know they had less than 5 minutes, and as short as 30 seconds maybe even. So that's incredibly fast, far faster than any human could react.
The scoreboard in round 64, Mayhem is still on top.
Of course, they're on top, but we are starting to see a little bit of a relative dip here now, right? I think we're seeing that lead, that over 9,000 point lead has definitely decreased. And so now it's getting a little bit smaller. Still pretty solid though. I don't think they're in any danger of being overtaken anytime soon.
I think this right here is real interesting with Rubeus and Mechafish still kind of very tightly battling it out for third place. And this is important because third place was a money-winning position.
Yeah, third and fourth is still a really big battle. And certainly Mechafish was actually in contention for second up until that big dip, and they haven't been able to kind of claw their way back up, but third and fourth is quite tight. I think if we look at it too, it's the story has been for Mechafish a lot of time we've commented is their availability and the patches that we keep seeing them do, and you can definitely see that the green there is going to be the trend for them, and that's what's hurting them now. I think their other numbers are much better. I think they've got a better evaluation, but if they can't,
we can see on these lines down here that their security and evaluation are nearly the top.
Yeah, in fact, I think they probably are the top for both of those. They have the best, at least tied with Xandra for security, but the top evaluation. But in this case, Rubeus has got a little bit better availability, though still not as good as Mayhem, who clearly has the dominant availability.
Yeah, we keep seeing that being such an important component of the game. The scoreboard in round 67. Now, 67 is an important round because this is the first time that we had official confirmation that Mayhem was really dead in the water.
Yeah.
So we had seen that early on in the game, they had been throwing a lot of POVs, they've been taking a lot of action, and then we see after that, for a while now, they've not been throwing new POVs, they haven't submitted any replacements, they just kind of haven't been doing anything. Now, they're still in the lead, but their lead is shrinking, and they're just sort of coasting from the position they were at.
If something happens with your CRS and a part of it goes down, do you have any contingencies in place to mitigate that?
Yeah, in our CRS, we built in parts that would, for example, completely reboot VMs if it seemed like they weren't performing and restart systems. So we made heavy use of essentially reboot and pray approaches because our own systems, we've designed them pretty well, but you have to make them fault tolerant.
How many actually pieces do you have that you have to maintain their running?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different pieces in this, right? So we have an offense, we have a bunch of different fuzzer symbolic executors and a bunch of VMs devoted to that. And we prioritize how many resources go to that. For defense, there's patching, that's a little bit more lightweight, but then there's the CRS part, the thing that binds it all together and makes the decisions. And for that, that's kind of the most difficult to protect against because it's kind of one centralized piece that just has to work.
You kind of had an all hands on deck, let's audit the game so far moment.
The conversation at that point was mostly about what's your confidence level? How certain are you? Have you looked at everything?
Didn't Caswell go all the way up to the interface with Mayhem?
We tested every interface to the degree that we could. We didn't have, administrative insight into their CRS. We had opportunities all the way up until that edge to do different types of testing.
In this case, the event plan, which all three of us had worked on that week and we had committed to publicly before the event, was extremely clear. Disaster recovery only happens if there is a hardware-induced or framework-induced failure. And the result of Tim's game pause and audit and all his team's work was there was no hardware-induced or framework-induced failure. Mayhem had simply stopped playing the game, and we had to allow it under the full autonomy directive to be an autonomous system, and sometimes that means autonomous systems fail.
Now, thankfully for them at least, in this particular game, doing nothing isn't the worst strategy. Because you're not churning, you don't lose an availability, you're actually doing okay, but it really depends on how often your opponents are throwing successful POVs at you, because opponents who POV you decrease your security score, increase their evaluation score, and if they're patched, they're also increasing their security score. So it really depends on sort of the ratio of how many POVs are being thrown. In a very POV-heavy game, they would lose that lead very quickly, but if the POVs are kind of slowing down a little bit, which up until now I think sort of the last third or half that we've seen. We've seen a little less POVs than we saw at the very beginning. So if those POVs pick up, the pace could change. But for now anyway, they're still hanging in there. And they did build up a very solid lead with very good availability, very good evaluation. They had, while they were alive, we did see the best evaluation out of them as well. So they have a big lead to work from.
Yeah, that lead was definitely helping them along. This challenge, Ghost in the CGC, is very interesting because the author intentionally wrote it to be very difficult to patch.
Yeah, and it's got a good name too, of course. A little Ghost in the Shell code or Ghost in the Shell reference, that never hurts either. But
so what we're seeing is when every team, when they submit their replacement here, the ones that are trying, it's taken them a few rounds to figure out that didn't work. Like they're flatlined still, their availability is down. In this case, it's because they're not able to respond to the polls properly.
Yeah, it sort of had there were a couple challenges that had this kind of internal protection mechanism. They were akin to sort of DRM or anti-reverse engineering techniques where there's self-protecting against modification. A human might still be able to do it. If you see there's a checksum and you can patch up the checksum, you can absolutely do it. But clearly something that would be very hard for an automated system to arbitrarily detect the checksum, patch it, and put it in place. But what they should have figured out, though, is that maybe patching was a bad idea, right? They can test things. One of the things we haven't talked about is the round zero, right? The first round of every lifespan of a challenge set, you only have polls because you can't throw a POV until round one of the sort of the lifespan. And so during that round, you can know that everything from there is a poll, and you can replay that traffic against any kind of patch you have and make sure you get the expected back behavior.
Right, so what I'm noticing here is that there's actually a lot of teams that didn't even attempt to patch.
Right.
And that is maybe because they had some internal testing going on. They were actually able to tell their patch would fail and they didn't ever deploy it at all.
Either they were dead in the water like Mayhem at this point, or they had some analysis, or maybe they just decided they didn't have a patch. But for whatever reason, not patching was absolutely the right strategy for this particular challenge and the other one like it. It is also good to see who has sort of the solving capability. In some cases, if teams can patch before everyone else can get a POV out, maybe they got a POV but very late, we couldn't have seen it. Well, here's when you can't patch very easily, and so we do get to see everyone show their POVing ability.
Yeah, and you talked about those protection mechanisms. We have a capture of it here. What we're actually looking at is the algorithm that they're using to actually hash,
validate the,
hash the text section of the program. So you see up here, they have a for loop. They're just going through and reading the text section of the binary, and then they are checking it against an expected hash.
Of course, that's not stored in the text segment because it's a little tricky to put a checksum inside of itself, the checksums itself. But
yeah, it obviously has to be marked up after the fact.
Yeah, so they put that in the data segment. They match that value, and then they
and if it's not correct, the program terminates.
Just terminates immediately. Yeah.
So
that'll definitely result in a zero availability score. If
and like you said, I don't feel like that would be that difficult for a human reverse engineer kind of identify. You could even probably just knock out of this function entirely because it doesn't have any other effect.
Isn't
it's just
impact.
checking. But the machines were not able to figure this one out.
Yeah. Or maybe the ones that did are the ones that chose not to patch it correctly. So, but they certainly weren't able to patch around it.
Yeah, nobody had a workaround.
Looking around 80 now, we're going to see what the action is like. So we just talked about Ghost in the CGC. We know they had trouble patching with that. And I also even mentioned that isn't the only one. So we'll see some other ones coming up like that too.
So we see some scoring happening here. This is on the Trust Platform Module challenge. And we see both Xandra and Galactica seem to have found this POV. This challenge has been in play for 2 rounds now. And at least 2 teams scoring on it, although they're not going to realize these points right now because they're also down for patching.
But that's not the worst strategy, right? Actually, I'm okay with that in this instance, that they're throwing their POV the second that they know about it because they are decreasing their opponent's security scores. And in this case, they were right. One of their opponents was actually throwing a POV against them.
Yeah, so patching
from
is a
that
good move.
perspective, patching was a good move.
Definitely. So this challenge, just like Ghost in the CGC, has a protection mechanism. It's going to hash part of the binary. But unlike Ghost in the CGC, this hash is actually going to be calculated dynamically at runtime. So we're going to see right down here, the return value of this function is going to send back the hash, and that's actually part of the standard service pull.
Oh, so it's the network protocol, and you'd have to know what the right value was to return.
Absolutely. So this one's much harder to get around. Now, the machines weren't able to get around the other one either.
Yeah, unlikely they're going to figure this one out. So then we'd expect to see sort of the same kind of behavior where they're going to patch, fail, and the smarter ones will just never even patch in the first place.
So here, let's see how it plays out. We know last round that Galactica and Xandra had both submitted replacements for this challenge, and we see them there.
They're suffering for it.
Yikes.
Sure enough, yeah, they're losing availability on their polls. And it looks like they're still the only teams, though, that have figured out the POV, except we now have some new entrants into the Don't Understand You Shouldn't Patch Club, and Jima and Rubeus are also patching it. So unfortunately, they're going to be hit with the same problem.
Oh, and look at this here, Crispy.
Oh, yeah, that's actually not true.
Crispy actually came up with a working POV as well, so they're scoring here against Mayhem and Mechafish.
And most importantly, they've not yet patched it. So they are the only ones, this is the first successful points we've seen earned through evaluation on this without being hit heavily by missing availability points.
So 82. Let's take a look at looking back over TPM. So we were talking about how this challenge was basically impossible to patch, but so many teams tried to. And I love this graphic here because you get a really clear sense here of how many teams were down and for how long.
And you got to give Crispy credit here as the only team in the competition that's live right now that made the right choice to not patch this system. So I know their overall score at this point isn't looking as good for them, but that particular functionality right there speaks of a level of testing or internal reasoning that I think we would have hoped to have seen out of some of the other competitors.
Yeah, and we see that they found the bug and we're throwing against it. We see here that their cubes are deep in that direction, so they did have evaluation. Mayhem, obviously still dead in the water, so they didn't patch, but they also didn't score.
Yep, so they're going to keep that sort of solid 50% of the possible points right up until they're POV'd, and then they get a quarter of the possible points that would have been available.
So Crispy is a team that we haven't talked about very much. Crispy, the CRS was written by Dissect. Dissect is a group of people, their roots are really in CTF.
So there are definitely two types of people that do these kind of challenges. There's the people that do the official academic way, and they do theory. And there's the people that play the CTF, like us, that actually do it manually. We actually look at the binaries, we play the games. And for this approach, we needed both of those. And I think our team has a component for each one of those, and we put them together in a single system.
They came out of the University of Georgia, Athens, and they had the CTF team Dissect has been around for many years. Never like the top #1 kind of seeds in any of these sort of competitions, but a long history. And more importantly, they were a small team, and so I think they had a little bit of an advantage over some of the other folks in that they have been thinking about the problem for a while of how do we, with a small team, solve problems against kind of bigger teams. And so automation, exactly, that's part of the challenge. And so I think they were really looking forward to talking to them. They were really excited about the opportunity for CGC as a chance for them to dive into kind of what they had been thinking about for a while, but with the combination of their academic studies, as some of them as grad students, and as their CTF experience as well.
So this is round 93. 93 is actually the most scoring round of the entire game. So 5 different teams scoring against 3 different challenges. This is the most number of actual flag capturing that happens throughout all of CGC.
Right, so we're seeing a lot of POVs thrown, we're seeing a lot of success, and most importantly, we're not seeing any patching. So maybe they know that it's coming down.
The sixth sense, can a machine have a sixth sense?
I don't think, well, we haven't yet found out, but we'll see. Though we do still see a couple with, again, haven't got good reliability over here. So Galactica's got one that's got poor availability, and Jima's, again, got the unpatchable we saw in the earlier chart that they were never able to really get TPM figured out. Right until the end of it. The other interesting thing that happens is what's not visible, but we do know that Mayhem actually submits a POV this particular round.
So they're
right?
starting to recover from whatever condition they were in, maybe because the load has been decreased. There's not as many challenges. There's no challenges being added to the game.
Only being removed, exactly. And so we did see earlier on, by looking through when they were doing sort of debugging and troubleshooting to make sure that it wasn't an infrastructure problem, they did see Mayhem submitting replacements, submitting POVs for challenges that were no longer being run. So that was definitely a clue that they
got
were
out
sort
of sync somehow.
out of sync, kind of behind, stuck in some sort of older buffer. But now we have seen one submission for a service that is currently live, and so it'll go live round 94. So now we're going to skip straight over to round 95, the very last round. Yeah, we had one round in there where Mayhem got a POV in, and now they've added to the POV that they're throwing, and now they've got a replacement they're submitting, which, of course, in hindsight, is terrible timing.
Yeah,
because it's the last round, they'll never see
Galactica's
it.
down for a patch
Galactica
too.
also is going to be hit by, although I will say in Galactica's case, that's at least a service that was performing really poorly, so they're putting back, hopefully, either the original or one that has better performance, which would be good. Gma's going to ride that one out to the very end. They're going to leave that busted availability on TPM in there. So we saw Mayhem not only submit that POV, and of course you can see they've got two other teams successfully POV'd there, but they've also got an RCB that they're dropping in a replacement challenge binary.
Yeah, and too bad it was just the end of the game. They didn't have a chance to really
Too little, too late. Although it did also increase the differences between the two, because we've got Mechafish and Mayhem. The leads there are even greater, of course, this round, because Mayhem is actually patching, and as we know, that patching is a risky proposition.
Well, that's the end of the game. Let's take a look at the scoreboard. Well, down at the bottom here, we see Crispy.
Yeah, Crispy certainly score-wise doesn't look great. I do love, though, the fact that Crispy was the only team that we saw, of course, except for Mayhem, who I wouldn't quite count in this, that was able to sort of realize that both TPM and Ghost to the CGC could not be patched and never fielded a sort of broken patch in terms of functionality.
Yeah, so maybe they had a little bit more internal checking.
Yeah, their analysis clearly was solid there. Now, they did have an availability hit, probably for performance reasons, but not for sort of the functionality of maintaining what the program was supposed to do, so that's great to see.
Okay, and then we have Gma, second to last place, but Gma was still kind of close to everyone's heart because they were an underdog. They came in with very little experience in this area and wrote everything from scratch. So I love their story. I love that they actually came to the game and played. I think they had a great time, and I'm really curious to see what comes out of them in the future. They obviously learned a tremendous amount during this process.
Yeah, and not too far off from Galactica either, relatively close between the two of them. Galactica had one of the more interesting interactions, as we talked about earlier, the fact that they were able to respond and have this adaptive response to Rubeus, where they were able to change their POV depending on the conditions, was, I think, one of the most exciting stories for all of us behind the scenes to see. Certainly things like Crackadder were very cool, but the fact that this was a machine reacting to another machine in very short timelines to change their response was really cool.
Yeah, and crafting those ROP payloads, and
yep,
that was really interesting.
The adaptive ROP payloads that would exactly change depending on the binary. That was the sort of interaction that we were hoping consensus evaluation would bring about.
We have Rubeus. Now, Rubeus, they played a good game. They fought really hard. If it wasn't for their huge stumble, that we see here with when they auto-DOS themselves, basically, they probably would have done a little bit better in the game. Rubeus had, what I thought was awesome about them was their replacements that had the honeypot.
Yeah.
I mean, that was so effective
yeah.
Throughout the game, and just so interesting that they put that in there. I think that we talked about Mechafish had a honeypot too, but it was hidden behind their anti-analysis.
Yeah, their honeypot didn't draw flies, right, or didn't draw the bears to it. Whereas, Rubeus's honeypot was, I think we didn't even realize at the time of the game how effective it was. Only in hindsight, really digging through the data, do we see how often other competitors were attacking the honeypot as opposed to the real vulnerabilities that we knew the competitors could do. So that worked out well for them. And of course, Mechafish, other than the availability, the constant, they had a lot of replacements they were doing, and the sort of self-DOS as well as the slow early start with lots of patching. Other than that, they did a fantastic job. Best overall evaluation of the game. Hard to know what would have happened if Mayhem was alive. Certainly the first 30 rounds, I think that Mayhem had a better evaluation capability, but Mechafish did a fantastic job. We'd love to see the team, the structure, that sort of come from behind to nudge their way back into the money there. Was a great finish.
In second place, we have Xandra. Xandra, kind of stands out in second place because they didn't have the auto DOS situation, the kind of stumbles that Megafish and Rubeus had. They just had pretty solid performance right across the board. They didn't have quite a solid performance, as a first place winner, but they just kind of kept it together. They played a really, really decent game, and they came in second.
Absolutely. Of course, Mayhem, that lead really did narrow. The points here still at an 8,000 point difference looks bigger than it is, only because of the sort of relative scale of the total point buckets at this point, but that was only a 3% lead that they've gotten to narrow down to, so it certainly was getting closer, and had this continued on, we would have expected to see them swap places potentially if they weren't able to recover, but they only got this far because of that great lead. They really just did everything so well at the beginning, a fantastic evaluation. They were smart about the strategy. They didn't patch unless they absolutely had to in reaction to a POV that was successful against them, so they were very precise and careful when they patched. Good evaluation, and when they did patch, they were able to increase their security. So just that overall solid score, that 9% sort of lead was a massive lead that they amassed earlier up in the lower 30s rounds, and so they were able to keep that on to the end of the game.
So that's the game.
That's it. What's your kind of takeaway?
Oh man, there's so many things to say about this, and everybody keeps asking, what do you really think happened? What's the future of this technology? And to answer the first thing, what I really think happened, I think that we had 7 different teams come up with like 7 different approaches that all ended up having the same components, but putting them together in a different way, right? So everybody had a fuzzer, everybody had probably a stat solver, everybody had these special things that they tied together. They might have used an off-the-shelf one, they might have written one from scratch. They had the same basic components, but we saw drastically different behavior. So the way they tuned all of these, the way they instrumented them, and then whatever special sauce they put in to allow them to talk back and forth, came up with really different results.
Yeah, I think just in terms of the POVs, it was exciting to see Crackadder solved. It was exciting to see heap vulnerability solved. I think that was another kind of bit of a surprise to see those a couple of heap solutions. So those were good findings that we had. I definitely agree that the compositing is very interesting. So just because everyone uses a fuzzer doesn't mean it's not interesting. It's still very interesting because if it weren't, we'd all have the same results. Every team would have scored on everything.
One thing I'd like to see more of, and hopefully some academic papers will get released, I'd like to see more of, really what happened inside the machine, right? What was the trade-off between fuzzing and program analysis, and what at what point in the process did the two send information back and forth to each other? Because that's kind of where the special sauce is.
That's yet to be done. I think that we also saw reactions. We also saw things working very quickly. So even aside from the mechanics of specific solutions, we saw very fast turnaround. We saw machines reacting to machines kind of at machine speed that would some of those speeds outperform any human that I know
doubt.
of.
I believe that you and I could have written any of the exploits thrown in this game.
Yeah.
But there's no way we could have written them in 5 minutes.
Absolutely not. No, there's not a single, I've done the easiest exploit that I could write. Some of those simple basic buffer overflows are still going to take you 20, 30 minutes just to sit down and get used to it, and you're going to make typos. So those very, very quick solutions, I think, are also impressive, even if they were for straightforward bugs, let alone the more advanced, interesting things that we saw them do too.
This is just a huge leap. The ability, we tell a computer go and it can find vulnerabilities in maybe a dozen programs in a minute or less, and that's just incredible. A human just can't even process that much information.
I feel like it was a really important push. I think the idea of automating technology to do this has kind of been around for a long time, but everyone sort of goes, it's just so hard, and you're never really going to be able to get it to that point where it's as special as I am. So, but it had to be done at some point, and we're a little ahead of the curve. DARPA made this huge push for the community, and now we have technology out there that, 2 years ago, we would have kind of rolled our eyes at. I certainly hope that this technology is going to have a huge impact on the research community. I think it's a problem that seemed really insurmountable and sort of nobody's tackled before, and that's putting this all together in an automated fashion. And once you take that first baby step, it sort of sets you down a completely different path. Before we had disparate tools making a little bit of headway here and there, but the idea that we need to put them all together and let them collectively evolve into the future is, I think, a really interesting way to go, and I think it will have a tremendous impact.
We were pretty impressed.
there was some concern that no one would be able to exploit anything at first, because this technology is in its infancy, right? And you might know that the first DARPA self-driving car challenge, no one actually finished, right? And in this case, I think the bots made an incredible performance that no one can argue that they failed. It was a blazing success.
I really like the consensus evaluation component of CGC, in that the systems didn't just have to demonstrate a capability, but they had to demonstrate it in the face of an adversary. Because what makes security so hard is not that computers are hard. They are. Not that writing secure software is hard. It is. But it's that we have active attackers, is that the game changes constantly. And so you see that in the CTF world, because the CTFs of today are much more difficult than the CTFs when I started a decade ago. I have a hard time keeping up. I'm retired from the field just about because it's so difficult. And so you have to have that component kind of built into it. So I think that was really good to see. I know a lot of the teams spoke at the end of the event when we kind of circled back around, and were very appreciative of the chance to really just focus on this for a while and to do this, and they were kind of like ready for the next thing.
Well, and I love that so many of them had ideas that they didn't even get to implement yet, right?
Yeah.
So you talked to a lot of teams that said, well, we had this other cutting edge thing, but we didn't have time to work it in, or this really sparked our imagination for where to go next. So I think that we are going to see some really interesting research continue to come out from these teams, especially the academic ones that have the luxury of focusing in that area.
Decree is a great training system, but it's still a minimal system. We don't have the full set of syscalls that Linux does, for example. Yeah, so there wasn't file system activity. There's still enough other things that were not modeled in this that are, and not to mention size and kind of scope. A browser is a totally different beast from even the largest of code bases in the CGC binaries. So I think that there's absolutely still a lot of work to be done to deal with scale, to deal with other types of vulnerabilities. This was just memory corruption vulnerabilities. There's a lot of other types of flaws that we have to deal with. So there's still tons of things that to be done, but I think it was also enough of a success to say that this is not a dead end, that I don't expect to see any of these teams throw away their technology and be like, yep, well, we're done with that. I think there's going to continue to be improvements in research. They're going to expand out to other systems. They're going to be either open sourcing them like we saw with Shellfish, or commercializing them, or using them for their own security operations.
Do you intend to continue open sourcing your technology?
Oh, absolutely. Me personally, and the entire lab, and all of Shellfish, we are super passionate about open sourcing our tools and contributing back to the community. So I can say that our CRS will be open sourced, right as Anger is, including all of our build-ups on top of Anger, and we have a lot of code that we're very excited to share with you.
So I think Anger has, in terms of impact against the community from Shellfish's open sourcing Mechafish and other components like Anger, I think we've yet to see the full impact of Mechanical Fish itself, Mechafish's code base. But Anger, one of the components of Mechafish that's been out for a while now, has absolutely changed the CTF community. You have to test your reverse engineering challenges in Anger, or else...
Yeah, even if they're not meant to be solved in that way.
You need to intentionally put a hash in there or something else to break it so that they can't trivially solve it, because it took the work of hours of analysis down to just a few seconds of setting constraints and letting it solve it. So there's definitely been a change, at least in the CTF community. And I think the broader security community is still figuring out the best ways to integrate that into kind of their sort of traditional workflows. But I've definitely seen that approach permeate now the analysis that public teams are doing with the fuzzing that they do, and with the working with the analyzing of binaries that they're doing now.
Now we have these machines, and they can take all that boring stuff away and let us focus on the really difficult problems.
Do you see human-computer augmentation in this realm as kind of like the future and required knowledge or abilities going forward in CTFs?
Absolutely. I mean, the more I work on our system and look at DEF CON coming up, I just keep thinking, man, our CRS does these awesome fast decisions, fast patches, fast exploitation, and as a human, there's no way I can keep up with that. And trying to do some of this stuff without having our CRS or something like it, it's hard to imagine going back. It's like going back to the Stone Ages almost.
Just the other day, Void Alpha, the company that actually created all these visualizations, the filament view and the arena view, they open sourced that code, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's on their GitHub right now. You can go to github.com /void alpha and download Haxis, which is the tool that generates these. And there's even some talk about doing a 3D version. We've been able to try out the beta and go into the matrix, as it were, and manipulate, look around, get inside one of those filaments.
That is unreal.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing that I've heard a lot about, which I think is really interesting, is the corpus of the challenges.
Yeah.
20 of them were solved. That means there were 62 more that were not solved. And we have this standardized code base. There's patches available for all of them. There's POVs available for all of them. It just begs itself for additional research. And you're hearing a lot about that. People in all different areas using this code base to test their automated protection techniques and to test their automated analysis.
Yeah, that I have heard from a number of people who actually are more excited about the corpus than anything else out of CGC, because maybe they're either not interested in the security aspects of it or they haven't delved into the results. But just looking at the corpus of challenges, test cases for them, proofs of vulnerability, defined patches, that's a really unique test set that doesn't exist in that form.
Certainly not anything that's openly available.
Yeah, in that scale with open license and all these kinds of things, that's a fantastic resource. And if nothing else, it makes a great benchmark. If the best automated systems in the world could solve 20, as you said, 5 years from now, how many will they be able to solve?
Yeah, it's hard to prove entirely because the code's not secret anymore. But I would love to see, a year from now, 2 years from now, see someone come out and say, "Hey, I built a CRS that can solve
all of them."
All of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the conversation's changed a bit. I think pre-2013 it was which of these independent disciplines is going to be the way forward on drowning exploitable bugs in code. Is static analysis going to get there? Is dynamic analysis going to get there? What is the role of fuzzing? Is the formal methods, sat solver, symbolic execution community going to cross the finish line? And I think now, post CGC, these were just the pieces, and now we have a single thing, an autonomous system. And what are those autonomous systems going to look like as they progress for the next decade? But I would be surprised if every flaw in the CGC Final Event corpus is solved by an autonomous system inside of a decade. I would be very surprised. And that may be the one unique thing about this challenge is that we've kind of created a course or a metric for what the autonomous systems that are going to make these look incredibly primitive will look like.
The true impact of CGC will be played out in the years to come as these fledgling technologies grow into autonomous systems capable of guarding real-world networks. For now, let us be emboldened by the lessons of CGC. Autonomy is difficult, yet all 7 teams were able to field viable autonomous prototypes that wrote and managed their own patched software. We saw expert play. Crackadder was solved.
Mechafish was the only team to actually successfully POV against our version of Crackadder.
Teams also used heap exploitation. Zero-day vulnerabilities were identified and patched in minutes. Adversarial cycles. We saw adaptation and counter-adaptation between competing systems, an element of artificial intelligence and learning key to the future of these technologies. And lastly, the CGC resources have been put into the public domain and open sourced. All the data in one of the systems are out there for the researchers and CTF players to use and build on.
Mike, I heard you wrote 3 speeches for the end of the game.
Oh yeah, the job of a program manager is to be prepared. So I had to know what to tell the crowd if our very ambitious equipment plans failed, what to tell the crowd if the competitors were not able to play the game of hackers, and then what to tell the crowd if we succeeded. When you have adversarial artificial intelligence encountering its peers for the first time, one of the highly likely states is just a total systems crash. And it could have been, plurality or majority systems crash. And we wouldn't have gotten any type of realistic or authentic feeling adversarial interaction at all. Maybe you make your own luck, but I got to read the 3rd letter.
Which of those did you spend more time on?
Oh, definitely the first 2. Oh, they're so painful to write. the story of success is actually very easy to tell.